Hello there everyone, it is Toby from TIJ Music and welcome to another one of my album reviews. Today we focus on the man behind me, Bryan Adams, for his most successful studio album. Of course I am talking about his 1984 release, Reckless, released on the 5th of November 1984 on A&M Records. Now this was his fourth album, and although his previous albums hadn't done too badly, his first album wasn't great and not too successful. You Want It, You Got It was okay. Cuts Like a Knife, again, it was a bit of a progression. It did well in America and Canada, but not really anywhere else. But this was a box office hit. This week reached 12 million album sales worldwide. And when you compare that to Thriller with 47 million certified sales, it's not that bad, is it really? But I know that some people will say, well, Thriller has got far more potential albums sold that aren't certified. But nevertheless, it's not bad to have sold, what, about a quarter of those albums. 6 singles were released from this album, and all 6 of these made the top 15 of the US Billboard Hot 100, something that had only previously been done by the aforementioned album Thriller and Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA. Now, in terms of the songs that were recorded for this album, it was released in November '84 and was recorded really between March and August of the same year. Now, he'd done real extensive touring at Bryan for the Cuts Like a Knife album and came to the studio in March 1984. He'd recorded one song before this, which was called Heaven, which, you know, was one of the most successful singles from the album. That was recorded in 1983 for another project. It was recorded as part of the soundtrack for a film called A Night in Heaven, funnily enough. And the guys didn't really think it was suitable for the Reckless album, but they put it in at the last minute, and I think that was, you know, definitely the right decision. So the recording process started in March 1984, but Bryan took a break. He was okay for a few weeks, but took a break because it wasn't working for him, and took a bit of a break. And then he had a phone call with Tina Turner's producer, and this will become important in a second. Who's Tina Turner? And if you don't know that name, I don't know why you're watching, but Tina Turner's producer, there we go, called Bryan and asked him to provide a song for her upcoming album, Private Dancer, which would be released, I think, in the next year. But because he was working on his album at the same time, it was asked if she could perform on his album. And of course, that's something that happened. And the song that was performed by the two on the album was called It's Only Love. And from that, Bryan come back to the studio rejuvenated, re-recorded some of the songs that he'd done previously, and also generated some new ideas, which would come to be songs like Run to You and Summer of '69. Well, when the album was released in November, it was a hit. It really was. It went to the top 10 of the Billboard Hot 100, but the two singles, Heaven and Summer of '69, just elevated that further. And a full 9 months later, in August 1985, it finally went to #1 in the US. I can't really think of anything that would happen like that these days. These days, you have your first few weeks of an album and then it kind of settles down. For it to go #1 9 months later is a little bit of a strange phenomenon, but when you consider the competition it was up against back then, I guess that things can go in and out of action, I suppose. But this album went 5 times platinum in the States, 3 times platinum in the UK, and it went diamond, which means I think 1 million sales in Bryan Adams' native Canada. So if you haven't watched any of my reviews before, what we do, we go through each of the tracks, discuss them a little bit, give them a rating, and after we've discussed all the 10 tracks, we give an average verdict at the end of the video. Now, just having a quick look at the album cover. It's another classic, really, with Bryan Adams on the front. Not really too much going on. I don't know whether it's meant to be clouds behind him or just a general setting. It's not the most catching album cover in the world, I must confess, but when you see it, you know, when you see the album cover and then those songs on the back, I'm going to say before I start, this is just a really, really, really solid album. Hopefully that doesn't fall off, because when I put it there earlier, it did fall off. This is the guys who played on the album. You've got Bryan on the top left, then Jim Vallance, his longtime collaborator, on the right. You've got Keith Scott on lead guitars on the bottom left. He plays some outstanding stuff on this album. He really does. We'll talk about the guitars a lot. Then we've got Dave Taylor and Pat Stewart in the middle and bottom right. Can't tell my left from right there. But let's talk about the first songs. The songs on this album you've got on side 1, One Night Love Affair, She's Only Happy When She's Dancing, Run to You, Somebody, and Heaven, but the other way around. Heaven's track's 4 and Somebody's track 5. Then on side 2, you've got Summer of 69, Kids Wanna Rock, It's Only Love, the duet, and then Long Gone and Ain't Gonna Cry. And the album starts with One Night Love Affair. Now, this was the 5th single from the album, and actually it performed worst of the bunch. I guess something had to, and to be fair, it had some mind-blowing competition. But it got to number 13 on the Billboard chart, so when you're comparing 6 singles and the worst one got to number 13 on the Billboard charts, then clearly Bryan Adams and Jim Vallance, and of course the rest of the guys, did something very, very good with this. Now, it's a solid opening to the album, there's no question about that. You could say this one is typical 80s pop rock, and we'll get onto that debate in a little while. But this is something you'll hear a lot through this review. Great guitars. Keith Scott does a brilliant job on this album. It's timeless and it still holds up today, really. This track, I think, is probably an 8 out of 10. Track number 2 is called She's Only Happy When She's Dancing. Now, I've heard some people say this is filler. And I suppose when you compare it to the rest of the stuff on the album, maybe it's not up on that bar, that elevated bar that the rest of the album set, which is why this is such a good album. But it's a good track. I wouldn't necessarily say it's filler. It's a little bit underrated, actually, but it's not the best track. I'll admit that. But it is a good rocker, nonetheless. It just hasn't really got the pizzazz, I suppose, the wow factor of some of the other tracks on this album. But it's not a bad track. It's certainly solid, and probably a 7 out of 10. Then we come to track number 3, and this is really when the album starts to rock it starts to rock and really get into its element. 5 of the next 6 tracks were released as singles, and the one that wasn't a single isn't too bad either. But of course, this one is Run To You, one of Bryan Adams' most known tracks worldwide, and one of his most loved. And funny enough, Bryan Adams originally wrote this track for Blue Oyster Cult, who turned it down, and Bryan didn't really like it. But when was asked for an additional track for Reckless, he performed the demo, and of course the rest is history. And although Bryan Adams didn't like it, MTV certainly did. This was nominated for 5 MTV Music Video Awards. Not too sure about the theme for this one, given it talks about infidelity and almost promotes that. A cheating classic, you might call it. I've heard somebody call it that, can't remember who, so apologies for that. But the music video insists his lover is his guitar. So if we get away from that and all the themes that come from it, nevertheless, it's just undeniable that it is an excellent track. It's one of Bryan's most well-known. And great vocal range, great arena rock track, just a real anthem. Great guitars on this one. This has to be a 10 out of 10. And that theme continues really with 10s with the next track called Heaven. Now, we talked about this a little bit earlier. This was recorded a little bit earlier. And that's why it might sound a little bit different to the rest of the stuff on the album. The rest of it's very much pop rock, or even going into the, dare I say, hard rock feel. That'll upset some people, which we'll talk about in a little while. But it has got a bit of a different feel to those on the album. Of course, it was recorded for a different project, but it is an incredible power ballad. One of the best of all time, in my opinion. He always gets rubber stamped as Bryan Adams into the pop rock category, and almost too soft, and I guess this one you could argue maybe is, but I think it's a really heavy rock ballad, and the guitar playing once again is absolutely fantastic, so this one has to be full marks, 10 out of 10. So we end off side number 1 with Somebody. We've had the big power anthem of Run To You, and then the power ballad with Heaven, and now it's just time for a straight up solid rocker, which of course is called Somebody. And I'm not going to stop talking about this because it's there, and it's there throughout the album, and the guitars are sublime once again on this track. I'm not going to sit here and say it's a deep track and talk about all the lyrical meanings, because it's not, but it almost epitomises that arena rock feel. It's a great track really to close out side 1, and a bit of a fact here for you. Interestingly, the second verse has a lot of references to World War One. If I read it out, here we go. So, when you're out on the front line and you're watching them fall, it doesn't take long to realise it ain't worth fighting for. Now, that could be about anything really, but apparently Jim Vallance says that it specifically talks about World War One because Bryan Adams and Jim Vallance have a vested interest in World War One. Bryan Adams' grandfather fought with the British Army in World War One, so a little bit of a fact for it, although it doesn't really add much to the review, I understand that. But World War One is something that occasionally pops up in their songwriting, and I'll be interested to see where else it pops up. I didn't know that, but it's not a 10 out of 10 smash, I can concede that, but I think it's harsh to rank this anywhere below a 9, so that's where I'm going to put it at a 9 out of 10. We then start side number 2, I don't need to hear this again. Summer of '69. As I said, for the last time, I don't need to hear this again. But to be fair, I'll hold my hands up. It's good. It is so good. It's catchy as hell. Bryan's in, full screaming form. It's got all that feel of adolescence and trying to make your way in the world, in the world of music. And the guitars, all right, I've done it again. The guitars are absolutely killer. I don't want to mention too much about this track because, as is always done with some of these things, you take the biggest single from the track, the album, and you go, oh wow, it's fantastic, and nothing else really stands up to it. But I think that this is a 10 out of 10, no question. But I think the majority of the other singles certainly hold up to this, and this isn't just a standalone isolated gem off this album. Although it's great, it's probably on a par with some of the other tracks. So it is probably the most successful. It is probably the track alongside Everything I Do It For You. Debatable which one is the bigger track. I'd go along with Summer of '69. It's probably Bryan Adams' biggest track of all time. It's one of his most well-known, and for good reason. It's a very good track, so it has to be a 10 out of 10. We then move on to track number 7, Kids Wanna Rock, and this is a perfect example of something I was hinting at earlier. That people who moan that Bryan Adams is too soft, wishy-washy pop rock, I'm not really too bothered. And it's almost one of those statements of, to who it may concern, up yours, basically, without sounding too Valtteri Bottas-like. But there's not a lot of meaning to this one, I'll confess, but it's killer. I'm a hard rock fan, as most of you know, so any chance for those guitars, again, I did it again, to come out firing with that heavy drum beat, it's a really good drum beat on this one, I'm all up for that. I guess it adds to the arena rock feel of the album, but to another degree, I'm not really sure where it fits. I understand this isn't a concept album, but the rest of it has been kind of hard-hitting, punchy, good tracks. And this is kind of the same, but it goes up a level, and I'm not quite sure where it fits. But nevertheless, I don't think there's any reason to discredit this track for it. So I think this probably sits, again, same sort of level as One Night Love Affair at an 8 out of 10. Track number 8, It's Only Love. We talked about this one a little bit earlier. Tina Turner, the one that sang Nutbush City Limits, one of the best tracks of all time. Among others, of course. Well, let's have her in. I mean, Bryan Adams had some good collaborations in his time. We'll talk about When You're Gone with Mel C, All for Love with Rod Stewart and Sting, and even his most recent one with Jennifer Lopez. That's How Strong Our Love Is. But this is probably the best one. I say that through gritted teeth because I really do like All for Love. It's rocking. Tina has the same, if not better, range than Bryan Adams, and it's got all that exuberance of youth, funnily enough, despite there being a 20-year age difference between the two, and Tina Turner being in her mid-40s when this was released. But it is an incredible duet. The critics certainly thought so as well. It was nominated for the Grammy Award for the Best Rock Performance by a duo or group with vocal. I know, it doesn't exactly come off the tip of your tongue, that one. And it only lost to Money for Nothing by Dire Straits. And, okay, sometimes you have to concede. That track was big. But this, I think, is another 10 out of 10. Outstanding track. So, track number 9 is really the beginning of the end. Because the album's, I would say, most successful 6 tracks. Okay, One Night Love Affair was a single. But I think Kids Wanna Rock is in there. And for the sake of it, we'll say the album's most successful 6 tracks. A book ended by 4 tracks, so you got the 2 at the start and now the 2 at the end, which is started by Long Gone, that maybe didn't have the success, but arguably I'd say just as good and settle into the package. Long Gone, we'll talk about, is for track 9, so we'll match a 9 out of 10. It's a great song, it's about a messy divorce, it's another great rocker with catchy lyrics and even a harmonica, and I'm a saxophone fan, I'll confess. I know I don't mention it too much, but a harmonica as well in there? Sure, let's have it. And Jim Vallance said, it's meant to be a good rocker, a little bit like Ain't Gonna Cry, and not really anything more. And I rate that, I really do. It's a good 9 out of 10, and we move on now finally to the last track of the album, Ain't Gonna Cry. And this one is kind of like Kids Wanna Rock Take 2. It's a little bit heavier. It's an 8 out of 10, this one, I'd say. And specifically about this track, but I feel like the same sort of applies to Long Gone. Jim Vallance says that they were trying to write a fast, nasty rock track, nothing more. And I'd be inclined to agree, it's like Kids Wanna Rock, a little bit heavier, which I approve of, but like Kids Wanna Rock, it's not really anything more than that. It's a solid end to the album, mind you. And for some reason, I really dig the 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3. Don't ask me why, but I really dig that section. Just don't ask. So that one comes out at an 8 out of 10. And with that, it's the end of the album. And it is one of those albums, and it's rare. I was listening to it on the record player this morning. It's one of those that you go, is that it? I want a bit more. I want more from this album. And that's rare. You know, it's the sign of a very good album when it finishes and it leaves you wanting more. With most albums, you're thinking, right, this is good, but, you know, speed it along a bit. But, you know, it's a very good album. And the verdict here is an 8.9 out of 10. Again, very good. It is up there with some of the best albums on my list. And it is a solid album of the 80s. It's got to be up there, really, in the top 10, 15 albums of the 80s, in my opinion. It's so solid. It almost plays like a greatest hits album, which is why it's so solid. But Bryan Adams struggled to follow this up. He didn't really follow it up in the same way with Into the Fire, which isn't too bad, but I'm not too keen on it. But his album after that, Waking Up the Neighbours, which I'm sure I'll review in due course, really fires on all cylinders. But a really solid album is this. If you haven't listened to Bryan Adams' Reckless, maybe you only know the big three, Summer of '69, Run to You in Heaven, go and listen to the rest of this album. There are some real gems on this that maybe you haven't heard before. And if you were going to be introduced to Bryan Adams, and it's a funny relationship I have with Bryan Adams, not in that way, but he's probably one of my favourite artists of all time. But I'll go through runs of Bryan Adams, of I love listening to him, and then maybe not. But he's really up there with some of the best of all time. He is underrated in my opinion, and he's produced a lot of solid albums in his time. He really has, but this one probably the best. So that is it from me today. I hope you've enjoyed. If you haven't listened to this album, go and listen to it. If you have listened to it and you have an opinion on it, please leave that down in the comments. I love listening. Listening? Well, I suppose I can hear with my voice what you all say. But I love reading your comments. I really do. I think that just adds to the community vibe in this channel, which is exactly what I'm trying to build. And, you know, it's great. It's great to see a lot of support on the videos. And that is, well, it's not exactly what I do it for, but it's nice to see. It is certainly nice to see. It really is. It's great. But that is where we're going to end today's video. Subscribe if you're new to the channel for regular album reviews, top 10s and all that good stuff. And there'll be a load of stuff around the video with the end screen. So go and watch one of those videos at the end. I am waffling now, so I'm going to leave it there. Anyway, I've been Toby from TIJ Music. I hope you've enjoyed this review of the 1984 release by Bryan Adams called Reckless. That's been it from me. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next review. Goodbye for now.